Hello, my name is Bob Patten, and I'm lucky this year to be the visiting scholar in residence at the Charles Dickens Museum. The Dickens Museum, along with the Heritage Lottery Fund, has sponsored an exhibition here at Free Word at 60 Farringdon Road of banners and with legends and pictures all about Oliver Twist. We're hoping that this will be a setting in which people either virtually on the net or actually by coming into this wonderful space could talk about and think about the kinds of issues relating to Dickens, relating to the novel Oliver Twist, and relating to issues of social justice that permeated Dickens's Victorian world and are still very much current in our own. This is probably the most famous book illustration in history, and it's been adopted 200 or 300 times as a political cartoon because it sort of represents someone in need petitioning someone in power, so it could be even the politicians who are out of office petitioning the ones that are in power. But in this case, we have Oliver who has drawn the bad lot from his fellows and gone up to ask the cook at the workhouse where Oliver is staying for more food. There's been a long discussion about food and workhouse dietary, but the history of representing power as well-fed and poverty as ill-fed goes back a long time. And during the Revolutionary Wars, England prided itself on the fact that the roast beef of old England was still available for everyone to eat, whereas the French were starving and having soup maigre, which was basically water with a bone stuck in it. So the idea of the poor petitioning the rich for food is an old kind of radical theme about the disparity between one class and another. The boys' heads look very strange, and they really are quite caricatured because, in fact, the boys were hungry and their heads were shaved because of lice. Now that he was enveloped in the old calico robes, which had grown yellow in the workhouse service, he, that is Oliver, was badged and ticketed and fell into his place at once, a parish child, the orphan of a workhouse, the humble half-starved drudge, to be cuffed and buffeted through the world, despised by all and pitied by none. By 1834, the social safety net for the citizens of England had really ruptured because of the new manufacturing centers and poverty in places that had once been very prosperous, like the wool trade in East Anglia. So there was a rationalized system of social services developed by the government and imposed upon the old outlines of rural parishes and urban parishes. And it was supposed to make everything even. But one of the things that was required is that to get that social service, you had to go back to your home parish. And if you were living, let us say, in Northumbria, and your home parish was a London parish, and you were 8 months pregnant, the only way you could get help is to travel all the way south and get to that parish and get a ticket of admission. And Oliver's mother does get the ticket of admission and comes to the warehouse and to the workhouse and dies there. Now, she dies there because she's poorly, she hasn't had any nutrition and so forth and so on. But the other side of it is that nobody ever wanted to go to a workhouse because the whole theory of providing charity for the poor was to make it as despicable as possible so that nobody would go there and be a charge on the parish instead of going out and doing work. So the problem to begin with was that this was the most minimum kind of service that could be provided, and you only got to it if you could prove that you were a charge on that parish and not some other ratepayers organization. The other rule that the new Poor Law instituted was that the upkeep of an orphan child was supposed to devolve upon his mother or her mother and the parish. And so fathers got off scot-free, and probably reasonably because they couldn't be tracked down. So we have nothing about Oliver's father here, but the mother had to come from wherever she was to that parish, prove that she belonged to it, and get Oliver inside. And once he was inside and bathed and wrapped up in the swaddling clothes, You couldn't tell whether he had any distinguished background or no distinguished background. And in fact, in a cartoon here, in this cartoon, this is the beadle, and these orphans who were nameless actually got named by the parish. So we named our foundlings in alphabetical order. The last was a S. Swubble, I named him. This was a T. Twist, I named him. Oi, Bumble invented it. Oliver Twist. No words can express the secret agony of my soul as I sank into this companionship, the sense I had of being utterly neglected and hopeless, of the shame I felt in my position. My whole nature was penetrated with grief and humiliation. He's talking about a time when he was 11 and 12, when he was sent to work at a blacking warehouse, that is, a place where they made and put into bottles shoe blacking, because everybody had to have highly polished boots or shoes in those days. And he was very humiliated by the task and by the fact that his parents had taken him away from education while his older sister Fanny had gotten a scholarship to the Royal Academy of Music. So he describes that experience when he was 11 and 12. And those are pictures of actual Warren's blacking bottles, Strand. The warehouse was down crazy set of steps by the tidal river, the Thames, filled with rats. And Dickens was not happy with his companions. One of them was a chap named Bob Fagin, who took care of Dickens when he had a spasm of some kind one day. And unfortunately, the way Dickens remembered that, being known for having been dependent on care from somebody else, caused Dickens to migrate the name Fagin into the head of the gang of thieves in Oliver Twist. We have thought until recently that Dickens was put to work in this blacking warehouse a couple of days after his 12th birthday and when his parents were already in prison in the Marshalsea. Recent studies suggest that in fact he was put to work about September of the year before he turned 12 in following February. And if that was the case, and he hadn't been in school for 2 years before then, it was clear that the parents were thinking that this first son but second child would be what the children in any laboring family tended to be, which is contributing to the family's income from the time they were old enough to hold a job. And Dickens saw himself as having a better future than that, having capacity to be something better. So what might not have humiliated another boy under the circumstances, what might have even pleased Dickens under other circumstances, because he loved to perform in public, but he hated to be seen through the plate glass window of the shop, tying labels on blacking factory bottles, and seen by the public as nothing more than a laboring drudge. He blamed his family for that, particularly his mother at that time, though later evidence suggests that she was the one who finally provided him with further education and even helped him to get his first job. But for his memory, many years later of this experience, the whole nature was penetrated with grief and humiliation, and those sensations are refigured in the early life of Oliver Twist. Oliver was rendered the more anxious to be actively employed by what he had seen of the stern morality of the old man's character. Whenever the Dodger or Charlie Bates came home at night empty-handed, he would expatiate with great vehemence on the misery of idle and lazy habits, and would enforce upon them the necessity of an active life by sending them supperless to bed. This is an episode when Oliver has been captured by Fagin and his gang, and Oliver is trying to understand how the gang works and doesn't want to be the only person in the group that isn't doing something. And of course, in the great Lionel Bart musical, this is the great scene where Fagin teaches Oliver to pick pockets. You've got to pick a pocket or two. But what's lying behind that in this language is the language of capitalism, that you don't get fed unless you work. This is another version of the relationship between the starving and those who have plenty that we saw in the very first banner. And so Oliver wants to be not an idle apprentice, but an industrious one. And he's so impressed by Fagin's lesson. So he's ready to go to work. but he doesn't really much like the work he gets into. The first time that Oliver goes out to work with the Dodger and Charlie Bates, in an image we'll see in a moment, he's accused of thieving and tries to run away. Mr. Brownlow rescues him and Oliver goes to Mr. Brownlow's house. Then Oliver is lost again to the Fagans gang, and this time something even more serious happens. He's hired to go with Bill Sykes in order to break into a house in Chertsey. And that he doesn't much like. They travel from early morning to late at night across the city from east to west, go right through this area of town, right through Smithfield Market, and Oliver's up to his knees in filth and animal shit and draining of the blood and all of the other things that happen every day in Smithfield Market. And so he gets over to Chertsey in the countryside, and he is chosen for this job because his body has been trained for an industrial workplace just like other bodies were trained. Even though the Industrial Revolution had ways of magnifying human power through machinery with water power and coal power and other forms of power, they still needed bodies that were designed to work within the industrial premises. So we needed, for example, young women who could sit for 14 hours a day at a hand loom, producing just enough material to sell to barely make food enough to eat. They needed very strong navvies. The Irish provided a lot of these, who would come over and dig all the cuttings for the railways and dynamite the tunnels for the roads and railways. And they needed small children to do things like going down chimney flues. That was to be Oliver's first job when the parish sold him for £5 to a man who had lost previous children down chimneys. And in this case, Bill Sykes needs Oliver to go through the window of this wash house, which would have been, as you can see in the illustration, a little temporary lean-to outside the main fabric of the house, and therefore much more vulnerable. That window for a house in Chertsey, very much like the one Oliver was burglaring, is on display in the Charles Dickens Museum. It is very tiny. It's about like this. So there was a purpose for keeping children hungry. They were another part of the general manufacturing of Britain. But what I find interesting, and nobody's, I think, much commented on it, so I may be crazy, is that Oliver's coming through the wash house. Now, one of the other standard political themes for 100 years at least is the futility of trying to wash something dirty clean. Here's Oliver, who was almost sold to wash chimneys and being just black of face and body, inhaling all those carcinogens, trying to be a thief to get through a wash house. And when he does get inside the house, he is basically washed clean because he becomes taken in by the people whose house he was being forced to rob.